I rearranged this passage from Romans for two reasons. First, I wanted to show the continuity in what Paul wrote if you take out verses 1 through 7 in chapter 13. And secondly, I wanted to highlight the fact that they really don't fit or belong here. So let's take a little closer look at things. The letter to the Romans is very different from the other letters that we have from Paul, because Paul did not know the people to whom he was writing, or at least he didn't know very many of them. That's different from, say, Corinth, where Paul knew everybody, had been there, visited with them, was very familiar with everyone. So they knew what he was thinking and what he had said. What he wants to do now as he writes to the Romans is express to them his understanding of what it is or what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And in this part of the letter, Paul is expressing some of those characteristics which he thinks are typical of a person who follows the Jesus teachings. And he's describing it pretty much in detail, expressing what he believes. And what he describes is very different from the way people normally behave in the society in which he lived. I think the best way for me to illustrate that is with personal experience. Every minister knows that you don't get along with everyone in a church. And different ministers get along with the same people in different ways. And so you sort of expect that, and you try to work with the people as best you can. In one of the churches that I served, there was a man who really didn't like me. And the reason for that was because I wasn't the minister who had been there. So we got off on with a bad start that way. Then when I started preaching, I sort of challenged his understandings a bit. And occasionally, actually rather more than just occasionally, he would go into some sort of wild rant out in the parking lot after church that usually involved language that was so, well, let me put it this way. People collecting their children from Sunday school used the door on the other side of the church. I decided that the best way to handle this person was to be pleasant and courteous in his presence. Now, I always try to be pleasant and courteous. Well, most of the time I try to be pleasant and courteous. But I made a special effort in his case. And that blew his mind. If he was angry and discourteous to me, I should be angry and discourteous to him. And the fact that I wasn't was something that he just couldn't understand. Well, that's what Paul's talking about here. The contrast between the way things often go in the world and the way he understands people should behave toward each other. Paul actually quotes a passage from the Old Testament, and when he does that, he's encouraging the Romans to seek ways to fulfill the commandment to love neighbors as ourselves. Now, this is a countercultural approach, and it doesn't jive with Romans 13, 1 through 7. These verses not only interrupt Paul's flow, they contradict the central tenet of his worldview. Like Jesus, Paul was no defender of the Roman Empire, far from it. In fact, they both challenged the authority of Rome, and, if the tradition is right, they both died by Roman authority. These verses were added to the letter by some anonymous editor living much later. And the editors had a very different agenda. The editors' community was, I suspect, completely Gentile. And it wanted to fit in to the general Greco-Roman culture. The editor understood what Paul was writing or had written, but disagreed with him and tried to neutralize the countercultural edge to the letter. Now that we know where these verses came from, the question, I guess, is how should we treat them? Well, it seems to me that translators need to get honest and put them in a footnote someplace saying that they come from a later editor. Yet even doing that, we have to admit that they have had an impact on our political tradition. And the question that I have is, should they still have an influence? Well, let's consider the context in which they were written. Roman emperors were considered divine. That's something they cultivated. And they were very happy to encourage a cult of divine recognition. That cult operated in the background of the editor's mind. And what he did was quite simply baptize the cult. Instead of seeing the emperor as a god or one of the child of one of the other Roman gods, the editor decided simply to see the emperor as God's chosen leader. And in doing that, to some extent, he's keeping within his Hebraic tradition. There's a story in the gospel about the rich person that comes to Jesus, and he goes away sorrowful because he has lots of possessions which he doesn't want to give up. And Jesus says to the disciples as he goes away, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to come under God's imperial rule. And the disciples are shocked. Why are they shocked? Because in their mind, in the typical Jewish or Hebraic tradition, people are rich because God makes them rich. And Jesus said, no, people are rich because they manipulate the economic system to their own advantage. God has nothing to do with it. Neither Jesus nor Paul would say that the emperor had a divine right to rule. All right, shift now to our situation. We elect leaders. We know they are not chosen by God. We elect people to represent us in legislatures, and that's where the laws are created, so that we know that the laws are not handed down by divine decree from, Mount Rushmore. What we or our legislative representatives can do is renegotiate the laws when they prove not to be suitable. It seems to me then that any person using Romans 13, 1 through 7 to defend unjust laws or immoral public policies both misrepresents Paul and misunderstands the nature of democracy. The simple fact is that these verses don't apply to our situation, and we should relegate them to a footnote in our history. When we drop those verses into a footnote both in Paul's letter and in our cultural setting, we're still left with what Paul originally said. Paul's original understanding of our influence on public policy has to be one in which love rules. It's really the only way to both fulfill the gospel tradition and to discharge our civic responsibility.